Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching The Salty Sea, and I'm here today to talk about twists. Um, One of my more requested videos, actually. It's taken me a while to get it out here because, as you can see, the twist deck at this point with Red Harvest is quite thick. Um, Now, before I get to that, though, I do want to do a bit of news. Mainly Adepticon. Registration is up, open. Saturday competitive filled within hours, maybe even minutes. I don't know. I checked a couple hours after, and it was full. So that's great news for the game that 16 people signed up, within just a tiny period of time to go to Chicago to play. However, the Sunday competitive, at least as of recording, the Sunday competitive tournament still has open slots. That's the one I'm going to be playing in. I'm going to try to cover the Saturday one in some form or fashion. Hopefully, at least I'll try to have a winner's interview and maybe people who only have one loss interviewing them as well. Um, and then I'm also going to play in the Friday narrative tournament. That also has a few open spots left. Again, this is all as of recording. It's going to take a little while to get this video out to you, unfortunately. So hopefully that's still true by the time you see this. If it is, please come sign up for the Sunday one. I want to play against you. I will love it if you say hello to me while we're playing. Meanwhile, just an interesting thing, because I don't want to be like starting any beef or anything on this, but some other games that got a lot more slots, I wanted to look at how quickly they fill up too. Because as of recording, the Warhammer Underworlds had 30 out of the 128 spots that they gave it taken, and I know that Underworlds had tournaments with like 300 players before the pandemic. Actually, well before the pandemic, when it was pretty new, and that was starting to slow down a little bit before the pandemic, and then of course it was really hard for people to keep up with it. So I was kind of surprised that they still gave it that. Respect is the wrong word, because I do think it's a good game, and people like it for a reason, but the release schedule is so brutal, and the way the game is sort of positioned is so brutal that it makes sense to me that it's kind of going down in popularity. Kill Team also has pretty healthy, I would say, attendance. Of their 3 tournaments, 2 of them are kind of, one is full, one is almost full, and then one has quite a few spots open. But I also think it's interesting in terms of how much coverage you see of Kill Team compared to how much coverage you see out there of Warcry. There's really not very many people sort of out there making videos about Warcry, talking about Warcry, other than shouts to the Warcry Discord folks, keeping the competitive spirit alive. But I just think that's interesting that, it seems like Kill Team, probably about 3 times as popular as Warcry, gets way more than 3 times as much support. So I just think that that's really interesting to take a look at here. But meanwhile, let's talk about some twists. What do twists add to a game of Warcry? For the most part, I think, from a design perspective, I think the main thing people are looking for is replayability. Now, I actually think the core gameplay of Warcry is really good, but the twists, can make every game different, and I think that a certain type of player really likes that, and if that's you, absolutely, you should be hopefully really into an episode like this. They also give you kind of a way to tailor your experience, and by that, what I mean by that is, in the core book, they encourage you to draw a random twist, and I don't think that's a bad idea early on when you're trying to explore the twist deck, but I do think, and I've mentioned this in other shows, but I think it's important to put it here, I think a lot of the people who badmouthed Warcry early on as a game, and they're by far the main thing I hear about Warcry is, I love the game, but nobody plays it, so too bad. The main sort of thing that I think happens reading between the lines of when people complain about their first experience with Warcry, it almost always sounds like they got a twist that decided the game before the game even really started. And so I do think that just picking randomly for the deck isn't the best idea. Now you can sort of curate a deck, and I'm going to talk a lot in this video about how to do that, or you can sort of just pick one, you know. And if I were a tournament director, for example, I would tailor the experience this way too. I would probably say for a 5-round tournament, I would pick 10 twists. 3-round tournament, I would pick 6 twists, and I would just say, we're going to draw randomly from this very small group. And you can kind of put a lot of control over your games that way while still, having that kind of random, unpredictable element. I alluded to this when I said that the core gameplay of Warcry is really good. I think it's worth discussing whether or not Eerie Silence is the best twist. I used to think that for a long time. Still kind of think that, but there's no question that the presence of the twist deck makes the game overall a better game. If you do think Eerie Silence is the best twist, you don't have to play with twists. The other thing you can do is if you think if you're like me and you think Eerie Silence is the best twist, but you like having twists sometimes, just take some of the bad twists, Sharpie them out, and just write Eerie Silence on them, and then put them back in the deck, and then that way you can make it so that you have like a 1 in 3 chance of getting Eerie Silence, and then maybe a 2 in 3 chance of getting a regular twist, something like that. You can do stuff like that, and because it's your game. I also wanted to talk about twists for, and this is going to come back a few times, twists for casual play and twists for competitive play. When I think about a good casual twist, I'm looking for something that's going to make something crazy happen, make something memorable happen to the game. When I look for something that's a competitive twist, I'm looking for something that's going to either make the game more balanced, and I think some of the more recent Red Harvest twists have done a good job with this. Red Harvest victory conditions also. Maybe victory conditions will be the subject of another video. About 9 months ago, Rito and I did a video on victory conditions that I thought was really good discussion, and people can check that one out. So if it's not helping balance, I like something that introduces a strategy wrinkle that both players get to consider. There are some twists where you roll a dice and whoever wins the die roll gets a really interesting strategy decision, but it either has no effect really on the game, or it just makes it whoever won that die roll just wins. And so those are the kind of twists I'm going to try to steer you away from in this video. So I think because this twist deck is, again, so big, I think it's worth breaking the twists down into kind of categories. And luckily they help you with that right away by, this little rune mark. This little rune mark at the bottom here. So the one for chaotic beasts is pretty clear, and it's a little animal in the bottom right, and there's a whole bunch of them, and they're really interesting taken as a group. So for your games, they're going to increase variance a whole bunch. The priority die roll becomes really important, as is the roll for control of each chaotic beast. But while increasing that variance, they also help balance the activation wars. It gives you, if you have a low model count warband, it gives you things to do once you've run out of activations. Kind of forces your opponent to think about whether they want to activate chaotic beasts early to try to keep you from having things to do after you're done. Which then, if they do that and they lose the roll, then they're really out of luck, stuff like that. They also crowd the board, which if you use the terrain cards, having the chaotic beast twists can be really important for helping crowd the board, because some of the terrain cards are very thick, and then some of them there's practically no terrain at all. There's a few basically bowling ball terrain cards on those, and so having the chaotic beasts to kind of just get in the way can be really useful sometimes. what separates them, what differentiates them from each other is generally how many chaotic beasts you're getting and what the timing is, right? So, what round they appear in matters a lot for their effect on the game, as does their power relative to the other warbands. So there's one that puts out 800 points of Chaotic Beasts, and since I dropped the twist deck, that's really going to change this video, so I'm not going to be able to just show you guys all the twists I mean. But there's one that has 800 points slowly over the course of the game, and then there's one where you just put 300 points in round two. So that matters a lot. I also think so. The ones that come in later, there's a greater chance that they're going to decide the game if the die roll happens, and then there's more likely to be a place where you could put them that just really hurts one player and doesn't hurt the others. For the most part, how they're written and how the deployment cards are done, it's really hard. There's only a few deployment cards that allow you to place Chaotic Beasts in a way that really only screws one player if you're placing them in round one. And so I think that from a balance perspective, from a ensuring fun games perspective, I think that the ones that come in round one are the best ones, just because of that, because there's just fewer ways for it to go horribly wrong. And I do think if Chaotic Beasts aren't ruining your game, which kind of an obvious statement, but I think if they're not ruining your game, I think they add a lot to the game. I think in casual play, they're really exciting because, they are what they say they are. They are chaotic. They add a ton of chaos. But I think in competitive play, they can be interesting too. I think your mileage is going to vary based on the twist itself. The ones that come in round two are a little bit weaker. My favorite is the spiders one, because they're, the spiders are so horrendous in game in their faction, but they're actually pretty fun and harmless as chaotic beasts. I also think it's fun how fast they move. I think competitively it's really interesting thinking about all of a sudden having to time your movements and things based on not just what your opponent can do, but what might happen with the chaotic beasts. So I do encourage people to sort of, if you're going to curate your own twist deck, I would put in the one where they show up in round one, and the one with the spiders, and also the one where you get this. I think it's one of the round one ones where you get one beast, but it moves up to having 30 wounds, so you can have like a 30 wound Raptorix, which can be kind of cool. Let's get on to the climate ones. This can be a little confusing because here I've still got a few here. The difference in climate is it's a cloud with an arrow instead of others, which is a cloud with rain. Kind of silly, but the main effect of the climate ones is to just completely delete ranged warbands from the game. The exception is Creature in the Dark, which it's just, the idea is everyone's in the dark, a creature randomly kills, you roll, and if you win the roll, a fighter on the other team just gets taken out. It drastically punishes elite warbands instead of drastically punishing ranged warbands, but that's the only difference. Mostly just the climate ones just delete a type of warband from the game. I mostly don't like them. I think there's a real question to be had about whether this is even really a valid thing to put in the game, to just say target style of warband no longer gets to play. So I don't like having that. I know that a lot of people complain about ranged warbands, especially for newer players. Ranged warbands can really ruin your day. I think especially in sort of if you're a tournament director who knows that they don't have enough terrain to really heavily populate a board or as many boards as you need, I do think some of these are valid to put in. But in general, I think I would move towards the least draconian ones. So I think Blizzard, Howling Winds, and Dusk, all of these make kind of interesting mini games, and they don't just automatically destroy ranged units. Blizzard is a 9-inch cap that also messes with your movement. I think it's the one that Blizzard's right here actually. See, I did get lucky a little bit. Blizzard's the one that if you didn't move, you take 3 damage, which I think is cool. both kind of forcing you to do action. It does hurt ranged warbands in that they can't just sit there double shooting as easily. And then it also subtly helps out elite warbands more than chaff ones because it's easier to be able to afford that 3 damage. Howling Winds gives you -1 attack and -1 strength at range. Again, doesn't delete a ranged warband from the game. Is going to essentially neuter an all-ranged warband, but a warband that's relying on, say, 3 archers and then otherwise other things, I think you're still going to be able to function just fine in Howling Winds. Dusk, I think, makes for a really interesting mini game. That's the one where it's 12 inches, then 9 inches, then 6, then 3 as a descending cap. And that's just like if you are, say, Living Cities, which I've talked about, like the really silly Living Cities combo, for example. You can still try to get your combo in round 1, and then you're going to find yourself needing to play the objectives more and more and more as the game goes on, which I think is a good place to put ranged warbands. You know, to say, like, if you don't manage to table them turn 1, you are going to have to play the game. And I think it's very difficult generally to table really early in Warcry because of the way the deployment works. So as far as kind of silly casual stuff, not silly, but just really fun, wild stuff, I'm going to be mostly evaluating the casual ones based on whether you're, you know, having some beer and some pretzels, basically. I think Creature in the Dark can work in a casual setting. I think Ash Storm can work in a casual setting. That's the one where it does nothing unless someone rolls either a 1 or a 6. But you know, you roll every round, and if you roll the wrong number, the Ash Storm shows up, and no one can shoot further than 3. I think that has potential as far as narratively telling a story. I've also heard people say that Deluge is really fluffy for them because, you know, even though it's really brutal on ranged warbands, the fact that it makes climbing hard, I think makes a ton of sense. It's like, it's raining really hard. It's hard to climb stuff. You know, it's fluffy. It's narrative. I think a lot of people like it for that reason. I've had multiple people say for narrative play that it's really good for telling a story. But competitively, I don't really like Deluge. I think just in general, I think most of these are not the right way to be handicapping ranged units in your tournaments. Other than the 3 exceptions that I think are perfectly valid to put in a twist deck for any kind of competitive situation. So let's get into the Fate ones. The Fate ones go into kind of 2 categories. One just plays with the number of twists. I've got them listed out here. Whether they're good or bad just depends on what twist you get, right? So putting them in a deck where you like all the twists in there can be good, depending on whether you want to be having 2 twists in your games. Others tinker with the core game mechanics. So Tactical Guile, Warning Cry, No Holding Back, Late Arrivals. The 2 of them that do the reserve phase, like Late Arrivals, I really don't like them because they are really swingy, and the payoff isn't fun enough to, in my opinion, to justify the swinginess, right? Because it's one thing that happens a lot with those is one person rolls well, one doesn't. One person gets to play with their entire warband. One person only gets to play with half their warband, and you know, you can guess who wins. And the fact that that's just on a die roll and it completely decides the game, or it does nothing at all, I think is just a really weak place for twists to be. And I think there's too many of them like that. These are some of them, and I think that's problematic. In casual play, even the ones that I do like, there are a lot of bookkeeping. I think for a lot of people that's going to be fine, but it does just make it take longer to get a game going, and that's, you know, a small strike against something. If you know you're going to be drinking while you're playing, I would stay away from it. I don't know if that demonetizes this mentioning that or not. We'll find out. Competitively, Tactical Guile I want to talk about because it's a very spiky twist. Now, for people who don't sort of know Timmy, Johnny, Spike nomenclature, Spike is the one, people who play games because they want to prove something, or, you know, And some people are a Spike on one day and not on another day. But people who are playing to prove something, who kind of have that kind of killer instinct to win, there's kind of a classic designing philosophy about those people. In Magic, for example, they say Spike thinks they like good cards, powerful cards, but actually Spike hates powerful cards. Spike really loves skill testing cards. Cards where the better player, like that are more powerful in the hands of a skilled player than they are in the hands of a weaker player. So Tactical Guile is designed for Spike, right? Because it's like you make a big brain play. But it's really crap competitively because it's decided on a die roll, and it's actually a really obvious decision if you have played more than, say, 4 or 5 games of Warcry. It becomes a really obvious decision whether or not you should take advantage of it or not. And so it either does nothing at all, or it completely swings the game so that one person just crushes them. So keep that one out. I do think no holding back is really good. It changes game balance in a way that, depending on your local meta, can be problematic, but I think it makes the game really exciting. I think it changes how you think about abilities. This is the one where you add 2 to the value of abilities. There's one where you add 2 to the value of abilities in round 1, and there's one where you add 1 to the value of abilities. I think those 2 are both really good. They do specifically help Skaven quite a bit, and Skaven is probably the second most powerful warband in the game, so that kind of hurts a little, but otherwise, Skaven notwithstanding, I think they add a lot to the game, and I think they're worth including in any of your games. The other 3 types of twist cards don't have a central theme, so I'm going to just split them into my own themes here. So they kind of do 3 things, and it's just mixed within the rune mark. They either mess with abilities, they mess with fighter stats, or they mess with the battlefield. The battlefield twists, there's 4 of them. There's Mutative Aura and Insidious Malignance. These ones kind of change what's going on the field in a way that kind of adds depth, and it punishes high chaff warbands a little bit by kind of spraying some damage around. Like the one that does Deadly Terrain, I think is really good because, it makes you think about the battlefield in a completely different way. Then there's Murky Swampland and Awakened Machines. Murky Swampland just makes you slower when you're on the ground. Awakened Machines, I think the Red Harvest terrain is amazing, but I'm not a big fan of the delve mechanic in it. So these are, I think, both really good choices when you're in storytelling mode, when you're playing narrative play. But they can be a bit of a slog in match play. They generally make the game less interesting, not more, which I think is too bad. So if they don't fit your story, avoid them. If you're in match play, I would say avoid them. But the first 2, Mutative Aura and Insidious Malignance, I think are really good. There's also a bunch that change fighter stats, and some of them do it in really interesting ways, some of them do it in a problematic way. So there's 3 that I really hate. Grudge Match, Enervating Totem, and Winds of Rot. And the reason I hate them, first, is toughness and strength modifiers in this game are awful. And the reason is, so high strength toughness fighters can lose from dropping 1, but they don't gain from getting a boost. And low strength and toughness fighters can gain from getting a boost, but they're unaffected from losing 1. And the way the game is pointed, low strength and toughness fighters, the way, the cards, how many points each fighter costs, really favors low strength, low toughness fighters just right now, because toughness is really overcosted and strength is just a tiny bit overcosted. It's, for the most part, it's pretty good, but it's just a little bit overcosted. So if you look at the strength 3, toughness 3 fighter against a strength 4, toughness 4 fighter, already the 3 and 3 fighter is pointed a little bit more aggressively for what it does. But then you look at these cards. If both of them get +1 strength, the S3 T3 fighter deals more damage to the S4 T4 fighter, but the reverse isn't true. If they both get +1 strength, the S5 now fighter attacking toughness 3 doesn't do any more damage. But of course, S4 attacking into T4 now does more damage. If instead both of them get +1 toughness, the S4 T4 fighter deals less damage now to the weaker fighter. But the reverse isn't true. The weaker fighter going S3 into T5 still does the same amount of damage. So just because of the way the underlying math of the game works, these are 3 of the worst twists in the game, just because of the toughness problem with Warcry. So I would just punt them out of your deck immediately, just right away. The one sort of exception would be maybe Winds of Rot. I think that's the one that adds 1 toughness to everyone. That one is okay for telling a story if you're playing 2 warbands against each other that kind of have similar strength and toughness stats, right? If whatever differentiates them is not based on strength and toughness. Say if both warbands are full of S4 T4 fighters, I think Winds of Rot can make for really interesting games by just everyone getting tougher, meaning that people survive a little bit more. But it's like you have to be very careful about where you put it. I don't think you could put it in a tournament. I think it would really mess up a tournament. The rest of the fighter stat twists I think are great. So Bloodwind, Eager for the Fight, Battle Frenzy, Bitter Rivals, these are some of my favorite twists in the entire game. All 4 of them force tactical adjustments without actually exacerbating an existing balance issue. So I think they're great for both casual and competitive. I want to rave about Bitter Rivals. It's the one where leaders get +1 attack, +1 strength against each other. Competitively, it usually only comes up in very subtle ways, but casual play, it tells an incredible story of like these 2 literally bitter rivals who just do so much damage against each other. Competitively, for example, I recently played a game. It was Flesh Eater Courts versus Skaven. The Skaven leader had no chance against the Flesh Eater Courts leader, but Bitter Rivals made it so that the Crypt Infernal was actually a legitimate threat to take out the Plague Priest in just like 1 round of combat. And so it never came up, but only because, as Skaven, I had to bubble wrap my Plague Priest to make sure that their Crypt Infernal couldn't touch me. And I think that that's really, just like an important subtle way for a twist to come into play, right? The leaders never got near each other, but it forced one player to kind of consider it in their playing, and then it forced, allowed another player to kind of dictate terms based on how their warbands were, and without really making balance too much of an issue, right? I think that kind of stuff is really, really interesting. Now let's get into the sort of ability twists, sort of adding or subtracting essentially the amount of abilities you can do. So, the list of them at my command through down to Azerite Lightning Storm, they either add new abilities for you to use or change wild dice. So these ones add or subtract abilities for you to use. I'm just going to repeat myself 20 times. This is great TV. In-game, they very rarely come up. The reason because most of them give you abilities that are not very good. So like Azerite Lightning Storm, I think is the one. Oh, it's one of the ones that fell on the ground early in the video. It gives you a pretty weak quad. Rainstorm of Gairan, it's a healing ability. Healing abilities, I think, smartly from the designer's standpoint. Designers, if you're listening, I think this was a generally good decision, but healing in this game is pretty weak generally and just not aggressively pointed at all. So these very rarely come up. But when you find the one case where it's correct and take advantage of it, I think that's an incredibly skill-testing thing to put in your game. And so I love these as twists that are very subtle. I don't want every twist to like make the game revolve around that twist. So as twists that are very subtle, add just sort of a increase the reward for high skill players without changing the game very much. I think that's excellent. My favorite is At My Command because Inspiring Presence is a really cool ability, but generally not as impactful as the other triples that are out there. So giving you Inspiring Presence for free, I think is really neat, and just makes the player who really understands, what kind of abilities they're looking for and what their sort of opportunity costs are in the game. It really rewards that player. So competitively, I really love all of these twists. Casually, because they're so low impact, you know, I think they're not going to make anything exciting happen. Now that might be a good thing. Narratively, I think that can be a really good thing if you just want to say like they're playing in the realm of life instead of the 8 points, or say like this Sylvaneth warband has brought magic from the realm of life, and that's why you have Rainstorm of Gairan active. And maybe it comes up, maybe it doesn't. I think narratively they're really good, but for a beer and pretzels game, I don't think they're as strong. So the other types of ability twists mess with the wild dice mechanic, so they either give you more or fewer wild dice. And I think that that's really good because the Warcry ability mechanic, just in general, of using wild dice and then using your dice to have abilities, I think it's really simple, really clean. It's part of what's so strong about this game, but it's not very deep. And I think in general, abilities don't quite have as big an impact in the game as you would like them to, except for a very few rare cases, and a lot of those cases turn out to be some of the best warbands in the game. So I think that these twists are really necessary for adding depth to that mechanic, and they give it variance, they give it replayability. I think they're just really excellent. So whether it's adding more wild dice in round one, or even the ones that make fewer wild dice, I think those are okay. Making it so that you roll and sometimes it doesn't happen, I think that's okay. I think all of these are good. Casually, I would say yes to most of them. Foreboding Location and Encircling Dire Flock, those are the ones that make it harder to use abilities. Those can be a bit of a drag casually. I think competitively they're really interesting, but I'm not sure I would want to play them in sort of a game where I'm trying to have exciting stuff happen. So that's all the categories. So I just want to talk real quick about the ones that I consider some of the absolute worst. So these are so first is twists that either do nothing or they just completely invalidate the rest of the game. There's more than what I've listed here, but I just want to single out specifically Tactical Guile, Late Arrivals, Favorable Position, Descending Ashfield, and Sinister Bargain as twists that most of the time you play them, you won't notice them. And the one time you do notice them, it'll make what could have been an interesting game into a non-game. These twists have no redeeming qualities, in my opinion, at least competitively. I do think, narratively you can justify any of them, and I think especially like Descending Ashfield could be really interesting, like between two ranged warbands. I think that could be really interesting narratively. But competitively, I think all of these are garbage. The other one is twists that I put here ruin competitive balance. I think the better thing would be to say they exacerbate an existing balance problem in the game. And they do it without being sort of memorable casually. So, like Murky Swampland, making people slower when they're on the ground. Well, like flying is already really good in this game, and so just having a twist that screws over everyone who's either not quick enough to get up on the terrain or not flying, I think is just really terrible balance-wise. Those ones I think are really problematic. So those are in general the things that I avoid, and the things that I pruned out in order to get to my twist deck. So here's the list. I'm not going to read the whole thing because I'm not going to read 27 fantasy names. But I picked out 27 of the 48 available twists. Now, I didn't go through Catacombs because they're in a book and you can't add them or subtract them from your twist deck. And a lot of them are more interesting in Catacombs. I think Catacombs in general just works very well as its sort of self-contained part of the game. I think Red Harvest was done, in my opinion, Red Harvest is an expansion of the base game, and I think Catacombs is an excellent side game. I've played a bunch of Catacombs games, I like them a lot. I would love to see an all Catacombs tournament, for example. I would have no problem with, say, a tournament director saying, round 3 of this tournament is going to be Catacombs. Everybody flip your board over. Something like that I think is really cool. But I didn't want to include the twists because I just think that that's a self-contained experience. So this is 27 out of 48. The 48 is the 12 Red Harvest plus the 36 base game twists. This is my list. All the ones that aren't here, so that's, what is that? Well, you do the math. I think it's 21. Those ones kind of all go into those last 2 categories. Or they're the ones that just delete ranged without the 3 that I do like from that category. And I just want to talk about my top 5. So Eerie Silence, again, this might be my actual favorite, but it's against the spirit of the list, and I wouldn't want to play Eerie Silence every time. My ideal world would be playing Eerie Silence about 1 in 3 games. So I do think it's worthy of my top 5 if I legitimately want to have it 1 in 3 times. But there are some really good ones that I think add to the game, and some of my other favorites. So Gore Moon Rises. That's one of the ones that adds to the value of abilities. This is the one that just adds 1. I just think making certain abilities have a bigger impact is really sweet. I know it makes Skaven stronger, and Skaven's the second strongest warband, but in general, most abilities that say do something equal to the dice, most of them are some of the weaker abilities in the game, so adding something to them makes them really interesting, and I think adds depth to the game. And in general, I think they weren't as aggressive with the ability and mechanic as they could have been, and so this helps. Then there's At My Command. I talked earlier about why I like it so much. Again, picking the right moment is really interesting. I think it's one of those things that is really rewarding as you play, figuring out the perfect time to use At My Command, and so I think it's really cool to have in your games. Battle Frenzy. This is the one that adds, I believe this is the one that adds 1 attack to every thing range less than 3. Or maybe it's 3 or less. I think it's 3 or less. And I really like this as very subtle anti-ranged effect where it doesn't stop ranged warbands from doing their thing, but if your opponent can close the gap with you, you're in real trouble. So I think that that's really cool. I also think it slightly favors low attack fighters, fighters that do more damage and have fewer attacks. And in general, not always, but in general, fighters that are statted like that with fewer attacks, on average, they do less damage per point than fighters with more attacks. Now that's, you can absolutely, there are lots of exceptions. It's a very loose rule in the game that fighters with fewer attacks are weaker, but it is something where adding 1 to everybody does help balance that out a little bit, and I think helps make the game much more interesting. And then finally, I've already raved about Bitter Rivals, so I won't talk about it too much, but it creates games where even though it has a very subtle effect, it can make for really thrilling experiences when it works, and even when it doesn't, that's totally fine. So let's talk about that twist deck that I just showed you for myself. That's a more competitive twist deck. It's mostly sort of to create really interesting close games. And I want to just talk about a few standouts for if you want to build kind of an alternate casual beer and pretzels twist deck, or maybe a narrative twist deck, something like that. Some standouts for games like that. Rampaging Beasts. 800 points of Chaotic Beasts slowly invade your game, and I think that can make for just absolutely insane games where, towards the end of the game, the Chaotic Beasts are outnumbering the warbands. it gets pretty wild. Uh, Creature in the Dark can ruin a game in the most hilarious way, and so for certain narrative situations, I think that can be a really valuable twist to pick up. Um, Winds of Fate is a really good competitive twist, but it's also just crazy for casual games. It gives you an extra wild dice. Um, so this is this the one that gives you an extra wild dice, or the one where you roll 7 wild dice? There's one of each, and I think they're both really good in casual play and in competitive. I think this is the one where you roll an extra initiative dice for the ability mechanic, which putting one more dice in makes it so you get way more quads and triples, which I think is really cool. Then there's Bloodwind. This is the one where if you've taken some damage, you do more damage. And it is also interesting competitively, but what it does that's amazing for casual games is it rewards playing recklessly. And who doesn't love that, right? I think that can just make for really amazing games. So I just wanted to highlight these four as well because they're absolutely worth playing with. So that's it. That's all the twists. All the twists talked about. I hope this gives you a good sense of kind of what you can or don't want to include in your games. I know, since there's 48 twists, I think most people watching this will not have played with more than half of them. So, my hope is that this gives you a good base to kind of curate the deck so that you don't get kind of bad experiences. Let me know in the comments if there's a twist that I left out of my twist deck or some of my favorite ones that you think is really awesome. There's always someone who comes in to defend the anti-range twists. So, someone who's been hurt a few too many times by lizard men or by Caradron overlords who just just really wants to play Dead of Night against them. So if you're that person, let me know in the comments as well. Otherwise, I'm probably going to make just one or two more kind of sort of more general videos like this before I get into kind of specifically Adepticon, sort of pre-Adepticon videos, both talking about what to watch out for at that tournament, talking about my tournament prep for it, stuff like that. So I'm really excited about Adepticon. I'm really excited to see a tournament. I think getting two 16-player tournaments in one weekend, I think it's going to teach, the people who watch the games, I think it's going to teach everyone a lot about what's actually going on at the competitive level of the game. I think a lot of people have have correctly identified, I think, what's the strongest things you can do in a vacuum, but that's only step one of creating a metagame for a game like this, right? You take the strongest things, you bump them against each other, and then you see what anti-meta things can survive there too. All of that is going to finally start happening in Adepticon, and I think that's really cool. So yeah, just a few more general videos between now and then you can look forward to kind of late February and then most of March. I'm hoping to put out quite a few videos then about it. As I said before in my last video, I am going to take January pretty slow. Probably this won't be my last video in January, but I certainly won't do more than one more. So yeah, until that Adepticon sort of hype mode starts in late February, may all your rolls be crits.